Okay, so for our final lecture for Church History 2, I want to give some historical background to the Civil Rights Movement and let you do some reading on how the Black Church really informs the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But in order to get to that point, in order to really grasp the significance of African American Christian voices in the Civil Rights Movement, we have to have some context, right? We have to think historically about the Civil Rights Movement in America. And so I want to give you some framework to think about the development of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s by going back to the Reconstruction period that takes place right after the Civil War. So as you know, the Civil War ends in 1865. And between 1865 and 1870, you have the Civil War amendments to the Constitution are in place. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing citizenship to anyone born in the United States, as well as guaranteeing due process, and then the 15th Amendment giving voting rights to all males over the age of 21. So those are very important. Now those amendments are going to be sort of neglected from the 1860s and 70s until the 1950s and 60s. But nevertheless, the Reconstruction Amendments, the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, are going to lay the groundwork for the Civil Rights Movement. Without those amendments in the Constitution, it's very hard to see how the Civil Rights Movement could ever really have gotten underway. Now, segregation and disenfranchisement of Black people in America after the Civil War really gets underway as a result of the end of the Reconstruction era. Reconstruction ends in 1877. And the marker for the end of Reconstruction is the withdrawal of federal troops from the old Southern Confederacy. Prior to that, federal troops had enforced federal laws in the states of the old Confederacy on behalf of the freed slaves. In 1877, those troops are withdrawn and Reconstruction sort of officially ends. Racism becomes sort of the rule because of a belief in the inferiority of Black people, which is really ingrained in the minds of white people really since the introduction of slavery all the way back to 1619. So efforts to deny, for example, Black people the right to vote become very pronounced and very subtle at the same time there towards the end of the 19th century. Because the 15th Amendment guarantees the rights of Black people to vote, the efforts to deny Black people the vote in the South are subtle, but they're very distinct. So, for example, poll taxes and literacy tests are administered to folks trying to register to vote in points south. So, like in Mississippi, Mississippi passes a residence requirement. You had to be a 2-year citizen of the state, and you had to live 1 year in the election district that you were in. And this residency requirements strikes at itinerant farmers that go from place to place to make a living, looking for work. And this is mostly Black people who are tenant farmers, going from place to place looking for work. There was disqualification for petty crimes. A poll tax would be owed by February 1st of a given year. And when Election Day came, the first Tuesday of November, what you need to do was produce a receipt for having paid the poll tax 9 months earlier. Well, if you lost the receipt, then you had no proof that you had paid the poll tax. And this, again, was looking especially at Black people who were itinerant farmers and didn't have a way to keep track of things like receipts over a long period of time. And then there were literacy tests that were administered. And there was a loophole for poor whites who couldn't read. So if you couldn't read the Constitution, then you had to at least understand it. And the loophole for whites who couldn't read was to be able to understand it, which is a very subjective sort of a standard. And so the registrar would be the person who judged whether or not you could understand a text from the Constitution. In Louisiana, you had the rise of what was called grandfather clauses. And so the grandfather clause allowed illiterates to qualify for the vote if their grandfathers had been eligible to vote on January 1st, 1867. Now, on January 1st of 1867, of course, blacks were still excluded from the vote. So if your grandfather was eligible to vote before that, well, that was going to guarantee that you were going to be a white person voting. So in Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, Oklahoma had all adopted grandfather clauses by 1910. Now, Jim Crow is the sort of the system of segregation that prevails in the South for 100 years or thereabouts, from the Civil War until the 1960s. Jim Crow, as a sort of a state-sponsored lawful segregation, begins with the railway train as the first target. Between 1875 and 1883, civil rights legislation made segregation in public spaces unlawful by federal statute. But in 1883, the Supreme Court struck all that legislation down. The 14th Amendment says that the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, that is the Bill of Rights, applies to the states, not just to individual action. That was the ruling of the Supreme Court in 1883. So in 1888, Mississippi and Louisiana passed laws requiring railway passengers to occupy cars for their own race. In other words, to segregate railway cars. In 1896, those laws were challenged in the Supreme Court in a decision that was known as Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, who was a guy that was 1/8 African American, refused to leave a white car when he was asked to leave and go to the segregated car. His case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled that segregation laws, quote, have been generally, if not universally, recognized as within the competency of state legislatures in the exercise of their police power, unquote. So what the Supreme Court was saying was that the 14th Amendment did not prevent states from enacting laws that segregated the races in public spaces. Now, segregation will spread from railway cars to every aspect of public Southern society, and not just in the South, but really all over the United States. Hospitals, hotels, restaurants, sports venues, employment, schools, housing, on and on it's going to go. The Richmond Times in 1900 said, "It is necessary that this principle be applied in every relation of Southern life. God Almighty drew the color line, and it cannot be obliterated. The Negro must stay on his side of the line, and the white man must stay on his side. And the sooner both races recognize this fact and accept it, the better it will be for both." Now, accompanying segregation are lynchings. Between 1890 and 1899, there are about 187 lynchings on average in the United States per year, and 82% of those lynchings take place in the South. Between 1900 and 1909, there are about 93 on average per year, and 92% of those lynchings occur in the South. Now, what is the response of African Americans to Jim Crow? Well, broadly speaking, and I'm going to speak in sort of simple terms here, they're not quite as distinct as I'm going to sort of lead you to believe, I guess, in this characterization. But it's basically generally a true kind of outlook on the ways that African Americans responded to Jim Crow. On one side of the issue is the side that's defined by Booker T. Washington and people who advocate for ideas such that he is the leader of. Washington is born in Virginia, born into slavery, and he got his education at the Hampton Institute, which was a post-war missionary school. And in 1881, he helped to form the Tuskegee Institute, which is Tuskegee University now. He said that American blacks should not antagonize whites by advocating for equality, for social equality, or for political equality. Rather, American blacks needed to establish for themselves an economic base for advancement. They needed to get education, they needed to learn trades, and they needed to build economic power, right? With economic power would come social power and political power. But those things are going to be down the road. Those things are going to come much later. For this moment, black folks who have just come out of slavery need to build up economic power. And the way to do that is through education. So to begin, as he said, at the bottom of life, stress opportunities to excel rather than grievances. He said, cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. Cast it down in agriculture, in mechanics, in commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. He said, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the 5 fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Now, this was what was called the Atlanta Compromise. The Atlanta Compromise would be that blacks would compromise with whites by relinquishing whatever claims that they might make on social equality, political equality. And instead, they would focus on educational advancement and economic opportunity. That's the Atlanta Compromise, right? And at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, this was a very popular idea, particularly among whites and most African Americans. For the most part, African Americans are look to Booker T. Washington as their de facto leader, as their kind of inspiration for advancement. As Booker T. Washington entitled his autobiography, Up from Slavery. This was sort of a representative idea for the majority of African Americans in the United States at the turn of the century. But there is another view. There's another approach to Jim Crow America, and this is sort of represented by the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was born in 1868. He died in 1963. He was born in Massachusetts, and he died in Ghana in Africa. Du Bois was a historian. He was a philosopher. He was a literary figure. He was a poet. He was a musician. He was sort of he was like sort of a black Aristotle. He was someone who wrote about a vast range of topics. He was a social commentator, a sociologist in many respects as well. And he criticized Booker T. Washington. He criticizes Washington in print. He criticizes Washington especially in his book, Souls of Black Folk, which is published in 1903. And in that book, he has an essay dedicated to the criticism of Booker T. Washington explicitly. Du Bois is the first African American to earn a PhD in history from Harvard University. And he said that education of African Americans should be more than just vocational. African Americans should more than just learn trades. He thought that African Americans needed to be educated in the humanities, in the liberal arts, and that black people should fill the occupations of doctors and lawyers, and should fill the educated classes up. He thought that African Americans should nurture leaders willing to challenge segregation and discrimination through political action and through social protest. He demanded the cessation of segregation and the enforcement of the Civil Rights Amendments. He said, by voting where we may vote, by persistent, unceasing agitation, by hammering at the truth, through sacrifice and through work. He said about the Atlanta Compromise, he said, "We refuse to surrender the leadership of this race to cowards and trucklers." So strong words there. He was instrumental in founding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, along with many others in 1909. So there are these two kind of approaches to Jim Crow America from African Americans. Booker T. Washington dies in 1915, and Du Bois is going to slowly but surely represent the position that African Americans will eventually come around to. That is, that they need to advocate for their political and their social equality. But it's important to note that Booker T. Washington's vision of promoting economic power and of learning trades and becoming skilled laborers, those folks that fill those occupations of skilled laborers, they're the ones that are going to form the basis for the civil rights movement. It's not going to be the educated elite that are going to form the core, the basis. They're going to be the leaders of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. People like Martin Luther King, right, who is highly educated. But it's going to be those. It's going to be the average Joe who's going to be filling those vocations, those ordinary vocations that are going to really form the core of the civil rights movement. I'm thinking of someone like Rosa Parks, who was a domestic worker. What does she do in 1955? She refuses to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's Rosa Parks that really inaugurates the civil rights movement in the South. Now, the civil rights movement gets underway, of course, in the 1950s, starting with the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, in 1954. In the 1930s, the NAACP had resolved to slowly undermine Plessy versus Ferguson, and challenges to segregation rise up through the courts in the 50s in 5 different states. Brown comes to the Supreme Court in 1952, and it's decided in 1954. And Chief Justice Earl Warren writes the majority opinion in Brown versus Board of Education, which is actually a unanimous decision. He says, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. And he cited current sociological and psychological findings that weren't available in 1896. And a year later, the court directed that compliance with Brown versus Board should take place, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed. Now, the court was not specific in terms of when desegregation ought to take place. It doesn't give the states a deadline for desegregation of schools to actually happen. Instead, it just says, with all deliberate speed. And so, in the South, those who are in charge of institutions and who are against the integration of public education take that to mean whenever you want. The response in the South was at first calm. Eisenhower, for example, was president. He didn't believe that it was within his federal jurisdiction as president to enforce Brown. He said, "I am convinced that the Supreme Court decision set back progress in the South at least 15 years. The fellow who tries to tell me you can do these things by force is just plain nuts." And this is what Eisenhower said in his very homey style. Hostility to integration is going to mount, slowly but very surely. Harry Byrd, a senator from Virginia, he is the animating force behind what will be known as massive resistance in the South. In March 1956, 101 Southern congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, which denounced the court's ruling, as it said, as a clear abuse of judicial power, as they said. The next big stage in the civil rights movement is the Montgomery bus boycott, which occurs starting in December of 1955. December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, she was born in 1913, she dies in 2005, was arrested for not giving up her seat on a bus to a white man. Now, Rosa Parks had served as a freedom fighter She was very engaged in the fight against segregation on public transportation. She had served as E.D. Nixon's secretary for 12 years. E.D. Nixon was the head of the Montgomery NAACP chapter. And E.D. Nixon and Joanne Robinson, who was the head of the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, wanted to use the case of an African-American woman being arrested on a bus in order to legally challenge segregation in public transportation. So when Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955, Nixon and Robinson asked if they could use her case as a test case against bus segregation, and she agreed. So the Montgomery Improvement Association was organized on December 5th with Nixon, Ralph Abernathy, and other leaders to come up with a list of demands for the bus company. And they elect Martin Luther King as president of the Improvement Association. Martin Luther King was a young pastor, new to Montgomery. He had just taken a pastorate in Montgomery, Alabama. King had not been, the city fathers had not laid their hands on him, so to speak. And so Nixon and Robinson and the leaders in Montgomery thought that because of King's youth, because of his vigor, because of his high education, because he was a gifted speaker, and because he was an outsider, thought that he would be the ideal choice to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. Now, King addresses, gives a speech, he gives a sermon at the Holt Street Baptist Church in Montgomery to a crowd of 5,000 people who were gathered to launch the bus boycott after the one-day boycott had been successful on December 5th. And he had 20 minutes to prepare his sermon. So he was really put on the spot to give his remarks. After King's sermon, and King's sermon was amazing. It was a brilliant speech, and it absolutely electrified the people gathered at Holt Street. And after the sermon, the congregation rises up and they sing, "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms," a great hymn, and a hymn that we don't sing in church anymore, which is a very sad thing. But "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms" becomes sort of a rallying song for the initiation of the civil rights movement, which is really neat. Now, King was born in Atlanta. He was the grandson of a slave. He got his PhD from Boston College. He got his bachelor's degree from Morehouse College in Atlanta. He's inspired by the writings of Henry David Thoreau and also of Gandhi. He said, "We must use the weapon of love. We must realize so many people are taught to hate us that they are not totally responsible for their hate." He said to his white opponents, he said, "We will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process." One of the things that was really compelling and really original about Martin Luther King's style was that he was convinced that through love and through reaching out a hand of sincere friendship to your opponents, you can turn an enemy into a friend. And this was something that really won over many white leaders and also unified the black community, especially the black community in the churches. That's going to end up, the bus boycott will end up with another Supreme Court decision in late 1956, ruling that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. It's also going to lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which is the first civil rights law passed in Congress since Reconstruction. It's a watered-down bill. Nevertheless, it is the first civil rights legislation in almost 100 years. In the 60s, the movement grows. John Kennedy is sort of a belated person who accepts the civil rights movement and the importance of civil rights movement, and civil rights agenda that Kennedy wanted to advance is cut short, of course, by his assassination on November 22nd, 1963. But it's picked up by Lyndon Johnson, and it results in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But one of the main impetuses for that bill was what occurred on August 28th of 1963, which is when Martin Luther King gives a speech to a civil rights march on Washington. This is the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And he said, "Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It's a dream chiefly rooted in the American dream. One day, sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood." Now, of course, his dream is not going to be realized immediately. 2 weeks later, 4 little girls are killed by a bomb at a church as they went to Sunday school. But Kennedy endorsed a civil rights bill. He was killed in that fall. Lyndon Johnson sees it passed the following year in 1964. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act is also passed by the Congress and signed into law by President Johnson. Now, there are going to be limits to what civil rights legislation can do. What legislation can change, it did, but legislation cannot change hearts. And, of course, during the 60s, the limits of legislation are seen in riots that break out in urban areas all over the United States. Even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964, even though the Voting Rights Act of 65 were passed, there is a lot of pent-up anger at segregation and at racial discrimination. African American Christians have historically integrated theology with practical considerations. Methodists saw the gospel in terms of both spiritual and physical terms through the lens of human dignity and equality, and Baptists are even more pronounced in the integration of sacred and secular. And Pentecostals also stress human equality in both theology and practice, namely that the gospel is more than just going to heaven when you die. The gospel has at its very core how God created human beings in his image, and that his coming down in human form, the incarnation, is the ultimate act dignifying the human race as a whole. And black people ought to be seen as equally human as whites. And so African American traditions understand the role of theology in their engagement with the culture over time. And their engagement with the culture is going to be, the civil rights movement, of course, is going to arise out of the churches. It's going to be arising out of the black church. It's going to be heavily informed by the social gospel. It's going to be heavily informed by the preaching of black preachers. And the African American effort in civil rights is always going to be seen through the lens of theological terms, justice that is expressed in the scriptures. The protests that are going to be launched in the 50s and 60s are going to be through a Christian lens, through passive resistance, through nonviolence. But as the civil rights movement progresses in the 60s, it's people who are not Christians are going to be frustrated by the slowness of reform. And this is going to result in the formation of the Black Power movement. After the assassination of Martin Luther King, black theologians are going to attempt to merge the nonviolence and the Christian aspects of the civil rights movement with black power. And what's going to arise out of that will be liberation theology, which is a take on Christian doctrine that is going to be really animated by the lived experience of African Americans. And so we've seen that there are dangers with that, and we need to be cautious. And the main thing we need to focus on is the authority of Scripture as it's been revealed to us through the canon of the 66 books. So that's going to close our time. Thanks so much. Appreciate your attentiveness.